Have you ever seen an elephant with 4 tusks? Probably not. And that's exactly what I'm going to paint in this video. Of course, this isn't actually an elephant, but one of its extinct prehistoric relatives called Stegotetrabelodon. I created this painting mostly from imagination, but I didn't want it to look like a fantasy monster. I wanted to feel believable. Basically, I just wanted to make this ancient creature look realistic as much as possible. Yeah, I think this time I may have pushed the realism a little too far. I started the painting on a canvas prepared with acrylic gesso. First, I made a simple pencil drawing and then traced the lines using an acrylic brush pen in a raw umber color. Lately, this method has worked really well for my direct painting technique. It's incredibly convenient to have a strong visible drawing underneath the paint layers because it helps you keep the structure and proportions without getting lost once the colors start piling up. Of course, sometimes the lines can become a little too visible and harder to hide later on. But honestly, that's usually not a major problem. What I really like about the acrylic brush pen is how fast and comfortable it is to use. Unlike a regular brush, you don't have to constantly dip it back into paint every few seconds, so the whole drawing process moves much faster. There is one important limitation though. This only works on acrylic layers, acrylic gesso, acrylic imprimatura, or other acrylic surfaces. You can't really use this pen over oil paint, because acrylic paint simply won't properly stick to an oily surface. If you would like to dive deeper into my painting process, see full-length tutorials, or access my books and behind-the-scenes materials, you can join me on Patreon. There are over 100 videos and a ton of extra resources waiting for you there. I'm adding new content all the time, so there's always something fresh to learn or explore. You can also subscribe here on YouTube so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. The Patreon link is in the description. Check it out. With the direct painting approach, I always begin by establishing the darkest darks first. This is a pretty classical foundation, and most artists who paint on a white canvas work this way instinctively. The reason is simple. The extreme brightness of a white canvas can completely distort your judgment of values and color relationships. Everything suddenly appears darker than it actually is. By placing the shadow masses in right from the beginning, you immediately create a reference point for all the other colors and tones that will come later. It gives your eye something solid to compare against, which makes controlling the overall value structure much easier throughout the entire painting process. So before worrying about details, textures, or fancy color mixtures, I prefer to lock in the shadow design first. It's one of those old-school painting principles that may sound simple, but it works incredibly well. The very first layer of paint always feels a little strange on fresh acrylic gesso. The surface is almost too smooth, and the paint tends to slide around instead of grabbing onto the canvas properly. Because of that, the first thing I usually do is create a quick, loose color underpainting. This first ugly stage actually has several important functions. First of all, it gives the surface a bit of tooth, so the following paint layers stick and behave much better. Painting directly onto untouched white gesso can sometimes feel slippery and uncomfortable, especially with heavily diluted paint. But maybe even more importantly, this first stain of color helps me judge later color relationships. Trying to accurately estimate temperature, saturation, and value on a completely white canvas is surprisingly difficult. Everything looks either too dark, too cold, or too intense because of the strong contrast of the white surface. Once there's already some approximate color on the canvas, even if it looks messy and chaotic, it becomes much easier to compare the next layers against it and slowly refine the painting. Instead of searching for perfection immediately, I prefer to throw paint around first and solve the relationships gradually. And honestly, I really like the visual energy of this stage. The brushwork is loose, sketchy, transparent, and very alive because the paint is heavily thinned down. Sometimes these early accidental strokes contain more movement and atmosphere than the later polished layers. I also use this transparent underpainting strategically in the shadows. In some places, I intentionally leave the first layer partially visible underneath the later paint. Because the layer is thin and translucent, a small amount of light from the bright ground underneath subtly shines back through the paint film, giving the shadows a deeper and more luminous feeling. In a way, this borrows something from classical layered painting techniques. Even though this is still direct painting, the transparent early layers create a slight optical depth similar to what happens in traditional glazing methods. The shadows don't feel completely dead or opaque, they almost glow softly from within. Once the first layer of color is dry, the next step is oiling out. I use this to restore the depth and saturation of the colors before continuing with the next layer. For this, I usually use a simple mixture of linseed oil and OMS in a 50-50 ratio. I apply it very thinly over the surface and then wipe off the excess, so the painting is not greasy, just slightly refreshed. Because I used a mixture of lead white and titanium white in the paint, the underpainting dries relatively quickly. The lead white helps the layer set up within a few days, which means I can continue with the second color layer without waiting too long. This step is really useful because once oil paint dries, it often looks duller and flatter than it did when it was fresh. Oiling out brings back the original color relationships, so I can judge the next layer more accurately. The second layer is really about refining what is already on the canvas. At this stage, I'm no longer just trying to cover the white surface or block in the big shapes. Now I can start correcting the forms, adjusting the colors, refining the temperature, and pushing everything closer to the final result. The first layer gives me the basic structure, but the second layer is where the painting starts to become more believable. I look at each area and ask myself, is this form turning correctly? Is this color too warm or too cool? Is the value strong enough? Do the shadows still have depth? Are the lights sitting in the right place? This is where small changes make a huge difference. I'm not repainting everything from zero. I'm building on top of the first layer, keeping what works, correcting what doesn't, and slowly bringing the whole image together. The rough underpainting gives me energy and direction, but this second pass gives the painting control clarity and realism. So for me, the second color layer is basically the tuning stage. The big idea is already there, but now I have to sharpen the relationships, improve the transitions, make the forms more convincing, and push the image much closer to the finish. In this stage, I start applying the paint in much thicker layers, especially in the light areas. And again, this is something I borrowed from classical layered painting. Even though I'm working more directly here, the basic idea is still the same. Keep the shadows more transparent and build the lights with thicker, more opaque paint. Step by step, I'm developing the form, adjusting the color, and adding more body to the surface. The lights can handle more paint. They can be heavier, richer, and more physical. This is where the painting slowly begins to gain volume instead of looking like a flat colored sketch. But the tricky part is balance. I have to be careful not to cover the shadows too much. Transparent shadows are incredibly important because they create depth. If I make them too opaque, they can quickly become heavy, dull, and lifeless. So I'm always trying to balance those thicker paint applications in the lights with more subtle, transparent passages in the darker areas. And sometimes a happy accident wins. For example, this lower cloud cluster was mostly left from the first layer. Those quick zigzag brushstrokes created something surprisingly interesting. There was already movement, texture, and atmosphere in that area. It wasn't just a flat color sitting there, it had life. So instead of repainting it completely, I simply adjusted the shape of the cloud a little bit and left most of that first layer untouched. And this happens throughout the painting. From time to time, I find small areas in the underpainting that already work really well. So the goal is not to cover everything, just because I'm adding another layer. Sometimes the best decision is to recognize that the painting has already given you something good and not destroy it. Before calling the painting finished, I always try to do one final realism check. Because with a subject like this, it would be very easy to push it too far and accidentally turn it into a fantasy creature. But my goal was different. I wanted this animal to feel strange, prehistoric, and unusual, but still believable. So at the end, I focused on the things that make the creature feel real. The weight of the body, the cast shadows, the temperature shifts in the skin, and the edges that disappear into the atmosphere. The tusks are obviously the main feature, but I didn't want them to look like they were just attached to the head. They had to feel connected to the skull, heavy, solid, and part of the anatomy. And this is where the final stage becomes more about restraint than adding more details. Sometimes one sharp edge is stronger than 10 unnecessary details. Sometimes a soft transition says more than another brushstroke. So the last part of the painting was mostly about making small corrections, unifying the whole image, and stopping before I destroyed the freshness that was already there. And that's all for today, my mates. If you would like to see the full version of this process, you can join my YouTube channel membership, Old Masters tier, where you will find this complete video workshop along with many others I've created for you. And if you want to go even deeper, you can also join me, of course, on my Patreon, where I share more in-depth content, extended lessons, and additional workshops designed to help you take your painting further. You can also visit my website if you're looking for some cool art merch, prints, and more. And if you decide to grab something, don't forget to use code M80SALE at checkout for 10% off your entire order. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks for watching, and see you in another vid.